So last week, last couple of weeks actually, this is the third week, I've talked about Chiliasm and the belief that God will only deal with mankind for 6,000 years and then he'll rapture the church. And then after that, Jesus will reign on earth for 1,000 years. So here we are now, we're just waiting for this rapture event to happen. And what will happen during the rapture is Jesus will come in the clouds and will be caught up. The word rapture means caught up. And that those who died previously will be caught up first. In other words, their bodies will come out of the grave and they will meet their new owners in the air, and they'll have their resurrected bodies and their eternal bodies at that point. And if we're still alive here, let's say it happened today, then we'll just be caught up into the air. But as we go, our bodies will turn into that glorious new lifetime body that we're going to have. And I gave you a couple of examples that kind of clear up some issues that we have in the Bible. If you remember, Chiliasm helps us clear up some of the things that we don't really understand in the Bible. And one of them, if you remember, was that God told Adam and Eve, on the day that you eat the apple, you will surely die. Remember that? By the way, if you are in here for the first time and you didn't hear the first two messages, you can go online, thewayicc.org, thewayindependentchristianchurch.org, and they should both be out online, so you can catch up. You can listen to those two messages from last week and then re-listen to this one if you want to. But I gave a couple of examples that clear up some of the issues, and God told Adam and Eve, on the day that you eat of the apple, you will surely die. And of course they didn't die, right? And death, of course, means separation, and it means separation from a lot of things, and they were separated from a lot of things. They were separated from God himself. They were separated from each other because they realized they were naked and they got dressed. They were separated from the kingdom that he had given them, given Adam and Eve, the paradise on earth, but they weren't separated from their bodies. Some people say he really meant to say separated spiritually, and that could be. But he also meant separated physically from your body, because the word death means all of those separations, and they didn't die on that day. So what happened? Well, Chiliasm explains that, because to God, we're told in the Bible, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. And so we know that Adam and Eve both died. Adam died when he was, I don't know if I remember it exactly, 938 years old, and Methuselah died 969 years old. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what would be, what's an extra 41 days or so that Methuselah couldn't have gone to 1,001? But he had to die on that same day that he was born, because to 1,000 years is a day as God thinks, and a day is as 1,000 years. But if we were going to understand this theory, now remember, this is theology. Okay, so I'm going to give you some dates today, and I'm going to say some things, and you're going to go, that guy's crazy, And that's okay. I don't care if you call me crazy, because everybody knows I am. But if you go out and bring this out on the street and start telling people about it, they'll probably think you're crazy too, and I don't want you to do that unless you remember that this is theology, right? This is the study of God. Theo is God, and ology is study of. So this is really a study, but it does answer a lot of the questions that we have in the Bible. And here's another one we have. We talked about it last week, was the genealogies. Remember that? We talked about the genealogies, and what we're trying to determine is when did God create the heavens and the earth? And so if we go through the genealogies that we find in the Bible, we come to a date of what? 4004 BC, right? Here's an example of what they look like. Genesis 5 through 11. These are the genealogies. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. Adam means mankind. That's what the word means. Adam means man or mankind. He created them male and female and blessed them, and he named them mankind when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness. Can you imagine having a son at 130? All the babysitting and stuff. No Saturday dinners out at restaurants. When Adam lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness and in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 100 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. Then when Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. And after he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 107 years and had other sons and daughters. So altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died. And then it goes on to when Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Kenan, and after he became the father of Kenan, he lived 815 years, and he had other sons and daughters, and altogether Enosh lived to be a total of 105 years old, and then he died. So we can go from Adam and go all the way in this genealogy. And as we keep going through the genealogies, eventually we come to the time that Noah was born in Genesis 30. And it says this: after Noah was born, Lamech lived 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Lamech lived a total of 777 years, and then he died. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So we can take that date that we have right there. We went from Noah. We know when Noah was born because it's in the Jewish old writings of the Jewish nation that they have the date that Noah was born. So if we start there and work these genealogies backwards, we come up to the date of 4004 BC, and that was the date that Adam and Eve were created. And you may believe, and that's fine, you may believe that the earth is a billion years old, and that's okay if you do. Some people believe in a young earth, some people believe in an old earth, and that's all right, and that doesn't interfere with this at all, because these are the dates that we find in God's Word. In other words, this is the starting point where he wants us to start at. He gave us this information so we could go back to this date, 4004 BC, and then work our way forward. The only reason he gave it to us so we would know that this was the time that Adam and Eve were created, and this is when the Bible starts. Now, the earth could have been billions of years old before that, I don't know. So, we have to have at least two good examples then to believe in Chiliasm. The first one we already talked about, and we understand that it fits in nicely. It doesn't do any damage to the Bible, that people lived, that to God a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day, and we talked about that last week, and it doesn't do any damage to the Bible. It doesn't hurt it in any way. The second clue we have, though, is in a very curious verse found in the book of Genesis, and this is attributed to Moses, that supports these dates. And in Genesis 6, 1 through 3, we read this: Now it came about when man began to multiply in the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he is also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Now, 120 years. So I'm not going to strive with God. I'm not going to strive with man anymore, God says. I'm all done with it. He's a sinner. He's susceptible to sin, and I can't strive with him any more than 120 years. Does that mean, what years does that mean? Does it mean like solar years? Like the way we travel around the sun? Does it mean like lunar years? The way that with old time the Jews used to talk about time through lunar years, not solar years. Does it mean that? Many people today suppose that the limiting lifespan to man is 120 years, and that's it. So no, it's not really talking about any year, it's just talking about 120 years. But we know people that live close to 120 years, and we have a couple of examples, documented examples, where people have lived longer than that even today. But after the ark landed, you go back in your timeline in your Bible, and you'll see that people continue to live to be 200 and 300 and 400 years old. Adam and Eve started out here at 900 years old, and then it came down like this, and it kept working its way down, and then this was the flood, and then it still kept working its way down, because of what? Sin. We were corrupted by sin. And now the lifespan of man is like somewhere around 89 years old, and a woman, or 83 years old, and a woman is like 86 or 87 years old today, and that's just the effects of sin. But what if Chiliasm explains this problem on the 120 years? What if this too fits into the Bible perfectly? And it makes sense of what God said. because it's in both the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint that we find this. Let me read this to you again. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not strive with Adam, that means mankind, that's the definitive article, because he is also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. That can't refer to the flood, again, because the human race survived the flood with God's help, and here we are again. And it can't refer to solar years or lunar years, because people lived past 120 years old after the flood. So the only years left that the Jews had was called the Jubilee. Have you ever heard of the Jubilee? Yeah, it's not measured by the moon cycle or anything, it's measured other ways. And a Jubilee is a very special year that only happens every 50 years. And here's how it works. Jews were told to plant for 6 years in a row. Plant for 6 years in a row, and then have a Sabbath on the 7th year. In other words, let the field rest. Let the field go fallow. Don't do a thing with it. So you plant for 6 years in a row, and on the 7th year, you let the field rest. Now you do that, again, we did that. I just thought of it. We did that when I lived on a farm, when I worked on a farm as a kid, a family farm. We would do that every once in a while. We would plant one field for 6 years, and then on the 7th year, we'd let it rest. And we called rain and snow poor man's fertilizer. That's what it was, because what would happen is you let that field rest that year, and when the rain and snow came down on the field, it had nitrogen in it. And that helped the field, and it brought the field back. So the next year, the crop would increase. So that's what we called it, was poor man's fertilizer. Excuse me. Mute that a minute. I'll turn it off. Give me a water share. Excuse me. So we have the fields rest on the 7th year, and then you repeated that cycle 7 times. So you go 7 times, you repeat it 7 times. Let's say we repeat it 6 times though. 7 years times 6 is 42 years, right? Then on the last cycle of that, you would do it again. You would plant for 6 years, let it rest on the 7th, but you'd add the Jubilee on the end of it. So now you have 9 years, 8 years in there. And together that is 50 years, and that would be called that. So plant, rest 6 times. On the 7th time, plant, rest. And that would give you 50 years, or called the Jubilee. Let me do this. Leviticus 25:8-13 says, you are also to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of year, namely 49 years. See, that's 7 times 7. You shall sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month. Now on the Day of Atonement, this is interesting too, you shall sound a horn all through the land. Remember what the Day of Atonement was? The Day of Atonement was the day that they took 2 sheep, and they brought one in and they sacrificed one, and they sacrificed it for the sins of the people. And then the other sheep, they called it the scapegoat. They painted it red and they sent it out in the desert to die. And so the sheep went out into the desert with all of mankind's sin on it, and it would die. And in the meantime, the people were atoning for their sins at that time. So you shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have the 50th year as a jubilee, and now not sow nor reap its aftergrowth, nor gather in from its untrimmed vines, for it is a jubilee, and it shall be holy to you. You shall eat its crops out of the field on this year of jubilee. Each of you shall return to his own property. I won't go into the legal aspects of that because it would take too long. But anyway, that's how we come up with the Jubilee. 7 times 6 is 42. On the last cycle of 7 years, you let the land rest 2 years, and then you come up with a 50-year period. So, if God says, I will only strive with mankind for how many years? 120. It can't be solar years, and it can't be lunar years. But what happens if it's Jubilee years? What is 120 times 50? 6,000 years. 6,000 years. Get it? Meaning the Spirit of God will only strive with mankind for 6,000 years, and then God will enter into his rest and fulfill the covenant given to Abraham in the final 1,000 years. So here's the covenant. We're here now. We have the rapture. We go up into heaven. We have that 7-year tribulation period on the earth. The first 3.5 years are called the tribulation. The next 3.5 years are called the great tribulation. After that, Jesus comes down to earth, and he reigns on earth with his people for 1,000 years. And that's what we're talking about. That's the millennial period when when God comes in the form of Jesus and reigns with his people. And you might say, well, yeah, I understand that, but this was given to the Jews. See, this is from the Jewish Bible, from the Old Testament, all of this information. And we don't follow the Old Testament anymore. We're not Jews, so this promise was given to the Jews, not to the Gentiles. Well, if you say that, that's okay, and that makes sense. But in Galatians 3:29, we read this. And now that you belong to Christ, that's you and I, you are the true children of Abraham. You see, this promise was given to Abraham, that God would come and rest and live on the earth for 1,000 years. And during that 1,000 years, the Jews would regain all of their land that God said they would. You know, the Jews have been over in there overseas for thousands of years, and 2,000 years, and they've never received the land that God promised them during this time. They're going to go all the way to the Nile and all the way here, and he's going to have a huge area of land, and this is when they'll have it, during that 1,000-year period. So now that you belong to Christ, you are the children of Abraham, and you as his heirs, and God's promise to Abraham belongs to you. So this is our promise too, that God will come and reign on earth in the form of Jesus for 1,000 years. So does this blend with the Bible? This thing called Chiliasm, does it blend with the Bible? I mean, it does. It doesn't create any difficulty in the sense of looking at it and saying, well, that doesn't fit or that doesn't fit. It does answer quite a few questions. Again, why Adam and Eve died at 900 years, and why couldn't they live to be 1,000 years? Because that would be day 2, that would be another day, or that would be another, to the Lord. And he said, you will die on the day you eat of it. I said last week, it couldn't be they had bum knees or something that killed them, because it had to be that they died on their birthday. Now, hold on. Today we have solar years, we had sidereal years, we have all kinds of years. We have lunar years, and we have, of course, the Jubilee. But here's something to think of. The Jewish text has always indicated that man fell into sin on the 10th day of creation. And that is what? The day of, I just mentioned it, atonement. And this is also the same day that God chose for the festival of Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, which falls on the 10th day of the first month of the Jewish calendar. So what the Jews have always say is that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, rested on the 7th, and then mankind sinned on the 10th. And so that's why they hold Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, on the 10th day of the first month. So they can let go that they can sacrifice the sheep and atone for sins, and then the scapegoat takes all of the sins of man into the desert. And if we count 120 jubilees from the fall of man on the first of this month, the Tishra, on the 10th day of year 1, according to the Chiliast, Christ will return on the Day of Atonement. Now think of that for just a minute. Christ will return on the Day of Atonement. Notice how this all works. I mean, you can't make this up. And I know you might be losing you, and I'm sorry if I am. I could take a lot more time on it, but I'm hoping that you go back and listen to this a few times and you'll understand it. The Day of Atonement is the day that man will atone for his sin if Christ returns on that day. Correct? Do you see it? The way that calendar runs? And it will be 6,000 years later than that date that we have in the Bible. That date in the Bible was 4004 BC, and it was on the 10th of the month. And our final question then would be is, where are we on that timeline today? Where do you think we are in that timeline? Are we close? Yeah, pretty close? Yeah. Well, if we go back and we count it down from creation to Abraham, we have year 1 to 2000. And something remarkable happens. Noah died on the same day that Abraham was born, in the very same Jubilee of 40, the 40th Jubilee. So Abraham was born and Noah died on the 40th Jubilee. We know this from the records in the church, in the Jewish church. From Abraham to Exodus was 10 more Jubilees. So now we're up to 50 Jubilees. And from Exodus to Solomon was another 10 Jubilees. And so now we're up to, now we're up to 50 Jubilees. And if we continue to Solomon and Cyrus, and from Cyrus to the crucifixion, and from the crucifixion and today, and guess what? We discover we are in the final 120th year Jubilee. Right now, we are in that final 120th year, going all the way back to Noah, where we have the records of when he was born in the Jewish Bible, and then we go back to, and then we can take the genealogy and go back to when Adam and Eve were born, and we're in that final cycle. The 50-year period, which will bring on what is called the 70th week of Daniel. Do you remember the 70th week of Daniel in the Bible? The 70th week of Daniel in the Bible is the tribulation week. And so everything fits. See how nice it's fitting? The 70th week in the Bible is actually Daniel's 70th week, and the Jubilee years fit into the 4004 BC that we're giving into the Bible. And so you might want to write this down. But before you do, I want you to remember this. Like I said, this is just theology. That's all it is. It's the study of God. This falls under the umbrella of eschatology. So if you wanted to go study eschatology, you'd study where the soul of mankind will eventually end up. So that would be, if you went to the seminary, that would be a course that you take for 2 or 3 years, because it talks about the end of times and where the mankind's soul will end up at the end of times. And then under that umbrella falls this Chiliasm. So there's a lot of studies that you get down to this, but again, I just repeat that they're just studies. But I'm going to tell you this. What they say, what Chilias say is this. The 7th year of tribulation period will begin on Rosh Hashanah, September 11th, in the year, are you ready? 2029. 2029. Which means Jesus will return 7 years later, because you have to go through this rapture. We have to be raptured. You have to have this 7 years of tribulation, and then you have Jesus' second coming and coming to earth. Which means Jesus will come on October 1st, 2036, exactly 6,000 years from Adam and Eve's sin and expulsion from the garden. I don't know. This is a study. This is just a study. But here's one final thing to think about. The final kingdom on earth will be a kingdom of both strength and fragility. And I think that's where we are right now. We understand that from our book of Revelation. Last week I spoke of America's part in all of this, which is very little, right? When you go through the book of Revelation, what part do we play in it? Nothing. It's very, very little, nothing at all, actually. If we have to diminish, remember I said we have to diminish before all this happens? We have to keep going like this. Economically, in military strength, we can't be the savior of the world anymore, and everything else that we do, our country has to begin to fall. And I'm not getting political here, but I'm saying it looks like we're doing a fairly decent job. It looks like sin and social agendas and the utopian fantasy of in the guise of democracy is just falling apart. It's just falling apart. And it continues to get worse and worse. Think back 40 years ago. Can you imagine what it was like 40 years ago and now today? Well, what's it going to be like in another 10 or 12 or 15 years if this is true? If this is true. So between now and then, the next 5 or 6 years, we can expect an emergence, I wrote this a while ago, of a socialist government. a government that persecutes Christians' beliefs, persecutes our morals, a government that preaches abortion, same-sex marriage, a government that opens borders and allows us to legally crumble. And all of these things are coming together. All of these things are coming together. Now we're in a war over in the Middle East, and now we know that there's more countries involved in it and more countries involved in it, and that goes into the book of Revelation as well with what happens on over there. So our government is going into debt. It's turning faith upside, Christian faith upside down, and there isn't a thing that we can do about it. There really isn't. It's gone. It's too far. Water's gone over the bridge. And this, I'm not being political at all with this. I'm just telling you exactly where we is. I don't think it. Like I said last week, Andy Mayberry has gone home. You know, we'll never see him. You know, never see him again. Gilligan's Island. They're off the island. You'll never have those days anymore. So it's an interesting study, but here's the key. It's not biblical. I can't open up the book and tell you, this is where it says just what I told you this morning. I can tell you the pieces are in here because I did quote from the Bible as far as the pieces go, and then it's up to you and I and the Chiliasm to put it together, but it's not, I can't point to just one part of the Bible and say this is where it is. And doctrine is the glue of the church. You see, there's doctrine and there's theology. Doctrine is the glue of the church. This is theology. Doctrine says that Jesus was born of a virgin, that Jesus is God in the flesh, that Jesus came to earth and died for our sins, that he died, was buried, and resurrected, and rose again on the third day. All of those things are doctrine, and those are things that we have to believe in. As to be a Christian, you have to believe in that Jesus, but you don't have to believe in this. This is theory. Okay? Theology, doctrine brings us together. Theology brings us apart, you see. Because some people believe it and some people don't. Some people think it's true, some people think it's don't. It isn't true. So it's just fun. It's a fun study, and I wanted to bring it to your attention. But what do we do? Well, Matthew 24:13 says, "But he who endures to the end shall be saved." And then James 5:11 says, "Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord," the end of times intended by the Lord, "that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful." So we have to endure. Have you ever seen a giraffe being born? I used to watch these shows on TV about animals and stuff, and they had a giraffe being born one day, and I really thought, I felt so bad for that baby giraffe. On the farm, I must have birthed hundreds of cows. And the cow would always just lay down and have a calf, and it was really nice. And then she'd come around and pick her up, and then she'd, clean it up. And, giraffe stands up and lets the baby drop on its head about 8 to 10 feet. Boom, hits the ground. And then when it hits the ground, it just lays there. So what does the mother come up and do? Kicks it. Takes her front foot and kicks it. And it won't move again. Kicks it again. And kicks it until it stands up. Now talk about endurance. That's endurance. But what she's saying is that, listen, you can't lay there. You're in grave danger if you stay there. You need to get up and you need to move. And that's what we have to do too. We have to endure through this. We can't just lay here and take it in that sense. I'm not asking you to go out in the streets. I'm just saying in your hearts, just endure through this. And realize that there's an act behind this. And who's the actor? God. God's behind this. I'm just glad I wasn't born a giraffe. But wouldn't it be funny if suddenly on September 11th, 2029, God took all of us Bible-thumping Jesus freaks out of the world, because that's what we're called, Bible-thumping Jesus freaks sometimes, took us all out of the world, Jesus freaks and goody two-shoes, and we went to heaven. Wouldn't that be amazing? September 11th, 2029. I got it marked in my calendar.